And I think I'll go ahead and get started. My name is Jocelyn. I'm the chef and founder of a plant-based food business here in LA called Todo Verde. And I've been making these culturally relevant plant-based recipes for some time now. And it's, I've been making a lot of these classes based off of my book, La Vida Verde, and the recipes there, but there also has been a demand of like more sweets and more this and more that. So it has also encouraged me to continue to develop recipes or to kind of, tweak the ones that maybe I've been making or I haven't really measured things. And so it's forcing me to measure things, which is always like the kind of interesting part of a recipe. Because I'm a home cook. Like I do a lot of what we call like tanteando and just, you kind of just have a sense of the food. But then when you have to measure it, then that's a whole other layer of like making sure it's precise so that it's consistent every single time. So today we're going to be making our gelatina, and I'm really excited about this one because I grew up loving gelatina de leche. My mom used to make it. In fact, whenever, I brought home a good report card or something like that, and she would ask me what I wanted, it was either arroz con leche or gelatina de leche. And then, yeah, so it's always been something that my mom has made. She would throw raisins in it sometimes, like there'd be little surprises here and there. And it's just one of the things when there's a family party, there's typically somebody, a tia, out of nowhere just brings a gelatina de leche, and it's always awesome, and then it gets really creative from there, right? Like you have the, she made another gelatina, like a lime one earlier, and sliced it up and threw that in the gelatina de leche. So it just becomes a little bit of art, which is so cool too. And so this one is 3 flavors, and they're just stacked on top of each other. Although you could get really creative with, the way that you wanted to incorporate this as well. But we have our base that is going to be, in fact, actually the top of the gelatina, but it's going to be the first one that we'll make. It's a cacao based or chocolate based flavor that has just a dash of cinnamon. And then we'll have the middle layer, which is a vainilla flavor. And then the layer on top will be a strawberry, an option to add rose if you want that infusion of rose flavor, but it could just be strawberry on its own. And I'm using an agar, which I'll talk a lot more about, which is a plant-based gelatin. And that is what's really going to bind our gelatina to form into a mold, essentially. And when you find agar, which is sometimes a little bit of a tough ingredient to find, you can't find it at your typical grocery store. You usually have to find it at a health food store, or you can find it online and get it shipped to you. But essentially what it is it's a dried seaweed. And it acts just like a gelatin in that it helps to kind of firm up and solidify liquid. And you can find it in a very fine powder, in a flaky, airy, light powder, in sort of this like a block. You can find it in like this sort of noodle shape that I've seen at Asian markets. And so you can find it in a lot of variety of shapes and sizes and densities. The one that I'm going to be using today is a really fine powder. And I didn't weigh the grams, but really the grams is kind of what works across the board because, for example, for some of the cheeses that I have, for the fine powder, because it's so dense and so fine, and almost a little bit heavier than the flakes and the other forms of agar, I typically have to use a whole lot less of it. So for example, I might use a half teaspoon of agar, where if I were using the flakes of agar, which is a lot lighter, airy, it's like kind of fluffy, then I would use a lot more. Like I might use a tablespoon of it. And so when you weigh it by the grams, then that really tells you how to use it in any shape, size, form. So if it's, 1 gram of the half teaspoon, then it's 1 gram of the flaky, 1 gram of the piece of the block, 1 gram of so on and so forth. And as you get into sort of like some of the science of plant-based food, it's always good to have a little scale in your house that weighs things by the pound or by the gram. They're pretty inexpensive to find. You can find this like at a Smart and Final or something like that. And it's just really nice to weigh something. And if you haven't used one of these before, when you turn it on, you can have like a cup or something sitting on it. And so when it turns on, it'll calibrate to 0 with that thing sitting on it. And so that way, when you spoon into it, it'll go from 0 grams and it'll only calculate the powder or whatever it is that you're trying to measure versus the receptacle that you're putting it into. So all that to get geeked out on agar-agar, which is like one of our main ingredients today. And in all honesty, agar-agar is an ingredient that as you work with it, the brand that you get, you're going to have to kind of play with it and figure out like, do you like the flakes more? Do you like the powder more? Is your powder more potent than maybe another brand that you've used before? So you may find yourself kind of like making the recipe one time and you're like, oh, I could use a little bit less or a little bit more. And you can kind of adjust based off of, because there's so many brands out there and all the brands are just a little different. So it's hard for me to say like, this is exactly what you're going to use. You might have to kind of adjust a little bit as needed is what I'm finding, because I use 2 brands only with Todo Verde. And as people have bought agar-agar to make recipes in the book, I'm getting so many messages and DMs of people who have like, they bought agar-agar in like capsules and agar-agar in the block. And like, it just kind of varies depending on like the brand and what people purchase. So you may need to kind of play with the recipe. But that's just kind of the part, like the fun part of it, I would say, to get the hang of it. So I am going to get started with the stuff on my stove. Let me go ahead and pin the video for my stove. So you should see that one as the main one. And I have here 1.5 cups I have a combination of oat milk and almond milk, just because I was running out of oat milk. I really like oat milk. It's been the main one that I've been using lately at home because it's such a neutral flavor. Almond has more of like a nutty flavor to it. And FYI, this is also unsweetened. So everything I buy is typically unsweetened, unflavored. I buy plain everything, plain nut milks, plain yogurt, plain whatever, like all plant-based, but very plain, never like flavored with vanilla or sweetened in any way. So just because I was running low on the oat milk, I mixed it with a little bit of almond milk. And my stove is not on yet. Obviously, you can see I'm putting my hands on this pot. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the agar-agar in now, and I'm going to whisk it. And you want to do this when your heat is still turned off, so that you, because the agar-agar gets activated with heat, and as soon as you throw it into the pot and it's already like boiling, you might just get kind of like a little clump of agar-agar that just sticks together versus like distributing evenly throughout your liquid. So you want to have no heat, just room temperature or cold liquid. Add your agar-agar, whisk it. It's very quick. You'll see right now. Let me grab my whisk. And then you want to turn on your heat and you can start to add your other ingredients. So we're going to do this 3 rounds essentially for each one of the flavors. So this first one is going to be my cacao or chocolate flavor. And so I have 1.5 cups of plant-based milk, unsweetened, unflavored. And I'm going to add a 1/2 teaspoon of agar-agar fine powder. So I have my 1/2 teaspoon measurement here. And I'm using this really, really fine, it's gum agar-agar. And you can see that it's like just a really, really like fine, almost like white sand, even finer than that, powder. And so it's a heavy bag. It's a little bit dense. I'm just going to put my 1/2 teaspoon in there, and I just want to level it out. And then I'm going to go ahead and put that in there into the pot. And I'll grab my whisk and I'll just whisk it together. It's easy as that. It's distributed throughout the liquid now. And I'll go ahead and turn on my heat now. I'm going to turn on to like a medium low. I think I have a piece of rose in there because I have it as a garnish here. And it's already pretty much mixed throughout. That's going to come up to temperature. And the other things I'm going to add to this mixture, I have here 3 tablespoons of raw cacao powder. Raw cacao powder, and sorry, it's a little bit washed out here, the light. Let me turn off this light and see if that helps. Yeah, that does help. Great. Okay, so I have 3 tablespoons here of raw cacao powder. And I like using raw cacao powder for a lot of my recipes because you can literally just taste the cacao. It doesn't have any toastiness to it. Raw cacao is different than cocoa powder. Cocoa powder means that the cacao has been toasted. So cacao is raw, cocoa is toasted. And that's 3 tablespoons of the raw cacao powder. And I also have 3 tablespoons of just like a raw turbinado sugar. So this is like a raw, low processed sugar. If you have white sugar on hand, you might find that it's a little bit sweeter because again, you can see here that these granules of sugar are pretty large and flaky, and your fine sugar will be more dense, and it'll, like, this has like air gaps in between the sugar crystals, right? So you might find that you need to use less of the white sugar if that's what you have on hand. I would start with maybe 1.5 tablespoons to 2 tablespoons and then work your way up as needed. You want this to be kind of sweet, like ice cream, for example. When you have something that is hot, it because ice cream obviously typically starts from something that's either like heated or room temperature, and then when it freezes, the sugar just doesn't come through as strongly. So when it's hot or warm, it should feel kind of like a little too sweet, and then when it's cold, it's going to feel just the right amount of sweetness. So this is 3 tablespoons of the raw turbinado sugar. I have a little pinch of salt here. I'm just using a flaky kosher salt. And then I also have a pinch of, I like Ceylon cinnamon. It's like that flaky Mexican cinnamon that you can typically find at most Mexican grocery stores. It's different than the cinnamon that you would use, for example, in an apple pie or something like that. So there's different varieties of cinnamon, but the one that you typically can find at Mexican grocery stores is typically the Ceylon flavored or type of cinnamon. So I'm just gonna go ahead and put all those ingredients into this 1.5 cups of milk mixture, and then I'm just going to use my whisk here to make sure that it's all well incorporated. And I just want to make sure you can hear me okay. Everybody okay with the sound? Okay, great. I couldn't find my headphones for whatever reason, so I'm just making sure I'm speaking loudly. Okay, so I'm just whisking together this mixture, and essentially what I'm gonna look out for is I want my mixture to slightly thicken up. The agar will just give it a little bit of thickness of, not thick to the point where like I can run a spoon through it and I'll be able to see the bottom of the pot. When I've used agar in some of the cheeses, if you've seen any of those classes, I use a lot more agar because I'm trying to get like a thickness for the cheese. But for this example, and also for that, I'm also using thick ingredients like cashews and things like that. And because this is so liquidy with just being a milk with some flavoring in it, I won't be able to get to that level of thickness if you've seen those classes, but I do want to be able to see that it goes from like just thinned out milk consistency to just a little bit thicker, like if you were making like a chocolate caliente or something like that, that you just start to see that it slightly reduces and you get another kind of difference in texture. So I want to bring this to like a nice simmer. And again, because the agar is activated with heat, I want to make sure that I get to that simmer so that it can really activate the agar and that it can melt into the liquid and make sure that that's what's going to gel up essentially our gelatina. And if you're using the flakes or the noodles or the block, obviously it'll be easier to see when it melts because you won't see the little crystals of the flakes or the noodles or the block that you cut off of the larger piece. But with this fine powder, it's harder to see it melt. So you kind of have to just gauge based off of like how you see your mixture thickening up slightly. And I'm whisking fairly constantly because I want to make sure that obviously I don't burn this mixture, or that, you know, once you burn the bottom of a pot that has milk in it, essentially that permeates throughout the entire mixture. So you want to make sure that you don't get any burning at the bottom. And then I want this to come to like a nice simmer for a couple minutes so that I know 100% that my agar is fully activated and that it's ready to pour out. And obviously with these recipes, or this recipe, I mean, you could add more to it if you wanted to. I tried to keep it fairly simple because you already have the 3 flavors. So you already have, you know, the cacao spiced with a pinch of cinnamon, the strawberry rose, the vanilla. But if you were making this gelatina just with the chocolate base, for example, you could potentially use a little pinch of chile, like a cayenne pepper or something like that. Maybe you can add a little bit more cinnamon if you really like that flavor profile. I just didn't add a ton of it because it's going to be competing flavors. If you start to add too much, when you take a bite and taste all 3, it's going to be a little bit too overpowering of one particular flavor. So I'm starting to get a little frothiness here. Starting to get a little bubbly. I'm going to lower my temperature a little bit because I don't want this to spill over. And one thing that I've just found also from almond milk is if you heat almond milk a little too much, if it starts like coming to a rolling boil, it creates a little bit of separation is what I found, where the oat milk doesn't do that as much. So it's just a matter, and it might be the brand that I'm using. Like I'm using typically like a Trader Joe's brand or like a Whole Foods 365 brand. It might be different. I haven't tried heating up almond milk that I've made myself, but that might prove to be a little bit different. It might be separating because the store-bought nut milk, almond milk specifically, has things that are stabilizing it and making it shelf stable. So that could be what's also causing the separation. Let me make sure I'm scraping my sides here. So you can see that it's still runny, obviously. One thing is like it's still runny because it's hot, right? Because the heat is going to make sure that it still keeps moving easily. And once it cools down, it'll prove to be slightly thicker. I'm just going to give this maybe like about another minute before I take it off the heat. And I'm actually using the same pot for each round. So I'll have to wash the pot between each round, which is totally fine. But my other pots are all big. This is the only small one I have. So I'll just have to do a quick round of washing this in between. You could also add a little bit of vanilla to this flavor, although we do have a vanilla layer. But that might be really tasty in here too, especially if, again, you were making this kind of just as a singular flavor, or just adding like maybe one more layer if you didn't have all the ingredients. All right, the last few seconds here. All right. I'll go ahead and turn off my heat. And I'll just keep whisking for another couple minutes just to help kind of cool down the mixture a little bit too. My heat is now turned off. And I'll just do this in between the rounds, mostly because I'm going to be adding this to a bowl right now, and it'll be the first layer. And then when I go to pour on the second layer, I don't want it to be like boiling hot. Obviously this isn't boiling anymore because I turned off the heat, but I'm just trying to reduce the temperature slightly so that it doesn't really affect the layer that's already inside of the bowl that it's getting poured into. And in between each layer, I like to refrigerate the previous layer for at least a good 15, 20 minutes or so, just to allow that agar to start to activate so that the colors and the flavors don't mix together. Okay, so I am going to prep this tray and I'm going to put my bowls on here. Let me just wipe this off. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put my 3 bowls. You can use 4 bowls. Actually, maybe I will use 4 just to have a 4th one here. This will serve 3 to 4 people. This bowl probably fits about like a cup and a quarter, cup and a half of liquid. So it might be a large serving size for somebody. So depending on your bowl size, you can adjust to make it for 3 or 4 people as needed. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to just carefully pour, and you want to be careful because you want to try to not like smudge the sides of the bowl too much, because then that's going to show up on the layers later. So you can clean it up if you need to a little bit. Like I just spilled a little bit on that last one. And you want to equally distribute this. And it's also kind of easy to clean up once the agar sets in the fridge. So if you have like, I'll show you right now in a second, like a little bit of like spillage on the side where it's like running. Once the agar is activated and it kind of becomes a gelatina, when you pull this back out to pour in the second flavor, you should be able to like really easily just rub that off. So right now it's still liquidy, but I'll actually show you what that looks like in a few minutes when it becomes gelatina. All right, so this is gonna go right into my fridge for a good, at least 15 minutes or so. Any questions so far? Okay. Whew. That was nerve-wracking, trying to get that into the fridge. Let's see what the chat is saying right now. So some folks haven't made gelatina from scratch. So great, I'm glad you're taking this class. I mean, if you haven't made the gelatina that uses the typical gelatin, it's a very similar process, although the gelatin that folks are using at home is typically like a powder, or sometimes they come in sheets, and they're essentially doing the same exact thing. They're putting the sheets in a liquid in a pot, and then with the heat, that gel, if a lot of times you see the sheets will melt into the liquid, and that's how you get that gelatina to activate. That gelatina, those sheets and that powder though, are typically made from animal bones, which is so crazy. A lot of like the candies that you see that are like gummy bears and things like that use like a gelatin to create those shapes, and they are typically made with animal bones, which is so crazy. So hopefully the agar will become a new friend of yours, which is seaweed, so you don't have to worry about eating some funky things. All right. And let's see, actually, I didn't grow up eating it. Awesome. So hopefully this can become sort of like a new option for you. And the gelatina that I typically grew up eating was, my mom would make it with whole milk. So it typically would be white sugar, whole milk, gelatin sheets or something like that, or a powder. And then sometimes there'd be like raisins in there. So you'd have little bits of like the colored raisins in there. So, obviously with this one, we're doing a different few flavors. So it really depends on like whatever flavor profile you would want to experiment with. So I'm going to go ahead, and I think my pot has cooled. I'm going to take a quick second when I didn't pin my video so you can see me talking. So I'm just going to wash that pot, but feel free to ask any questions. It'll take me just like not even a minute to wash it real quick.
Jocelyn, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I have a question for you. The pot that you're using, does it matter if you're using like aluminum versus stainless steel?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I find that, so at home, I only use stainless steel, but at our kitchen with Todo Verde, they had pots that we could use there, and they were all aluminum based. And I just found that they worked fine. Obviously, we were able to cook a lot of the food that we made there at the kitchen just fine. But I just find that it's, sometimes the food would burn a little bit at the bottom more easily than a stainless steel pot or pan. Just because stainless steel, especially if you have a nice thick bottom, will distribute the heat more evenly throughout. So obviously, like, you have one heat source and it's typically coming right at the center. But if you have a thick stainless steel pot, it'll heat up pretty evenly versus like aluminum, which will mostly just heat at that center point exactly where the fire is burning. So you just have to be more cautious to make sure that you're constantly stirring and checking and making sure that nothing is sticking or burning. So aluminum is fine. You know, sometimes there's some that will be like aluminum in the center, and then they'll coat it with stainless steel. So you have like kind of the two different options. I prefer, like, if you're just going to get a nice pot, just stick to like 100% stainless steel. I also don't use like Teflon based skillets or anything like that. I do have a ceramic one. Ceramic is harder to clean sometimes. Like, when things stick to it, you have to like really put some elbow grease into it to get it back to like looking brand new. But I use like a stainless steel pan, a ceramic pan, and then my go-to, which is actually in the oven, is just a cast iron. I use cast iron a lot. But for cooking like in a pot, like a soup or broth, things like this, I'll use a stainless steel pot. Okay, so I am going to get my next layer in there, and we're going to be making the vanilla flavor. One thing I will say before I get started, for the vanilla flavor, again, I'm using the raw turbinado sugar, which, as you saw, has sort of this like brownish, like tan hue to it. So it's not a white sugar. And obviously the vanilla that I'm using, which I don't have a label on it, but I like to use Molina, which is a vanilla blend. I get it imported from Mexico. And actually, you can now find Molina more commonly in Mexican grocery stores than others, whereas before it was really hard to find. So I get it imported with one of my vendors with Todo Verde. And so this is a vanilla blend. Obviously, you can see that it's a very dark brown. And so, you know, those two things, the vanilla and the sugar, are going to give your plant-based milk sort of this brownish hue. If you were using white sugar or a vanilla extract that's like more potent, where you use a few drops versus, you know, I'm going to be using here 3/4 of a tablespoon. So my vanilla layer is going to look slightly brown, which I'm okay with. If you had vanilla beans, that would be even better. Obviously, that's a more expensive ingredient, but what you would do with the vanilla bean is you would use a knife to slice it lengthwise, and then you would use the back of your knife to scrape out the little beans and get some of that little bean paste out. And then you can use less of that. And what you'll see instead is you'll see little specks of brown, which are the vanilla beans in there, rather than like a liquid like this that obviously just mixes into the whole mixture and kind of adjusts the color. So you'll see that my mixture, and you can probably see from the photo that was posted, that the color is like it's like a very light brown or something like that, that will be this vanilla flavor. So again, I'm going to add 1.5 cups of my liquid. I have a jar measured out here, so I'll make sure I measure out to a cup and a half left behind. So my heat is not turned on yet. All right, almost there. Let's see, just a little bit more. There we go. Okay, so my heat is off. I'm gonna add again this half teaspoon of agar. I'm just going to make sure that it's leveled out, and let me pin this video here. There we go. Oh, you can pin, I can pin both. Who knew? Okay, so you can see both now. I don't have to go back and forth. Perfect. Okay, so I have my half teaspoon of agar that I'll just go ahead and drop into that milk, and I'll just whisk it, making sure it's fully incorporated. And then let me go ahead and turn on my heat again to like a medium low. And the things I'm going to be adding to this round are, again, 3 tablespoons of this raw turbinado sugar. And I have a pinch of salt in here already. Again, that flaky kosher salt. And so I'll go ahead and throw that in there. And the sugar is also one thing that's going to kind of help get your mixture slightly thick, because if, you know, it's a good amount of sugar, and, you know, sugar creates syrup when it's heated up. So that'll also kind of help to create that like thick texture in the mixture as well as it heats up. And then I'm going to add here 3/4 of a teaspoon of vanilla. So let me grab I have 1 teaspoon, and I just won't fill it up. Actually, is this a quarter? I'll use this half teaspoon, fill it up once, and then halfway another time. So I've tried it with using a little bit less of the vanilla. Again, this is the Molina, and I find that I can still taste the oat and the almond in the milk a little bit too strongly. So this is half a teaspoon so far, and let me add the other little quarter. So it's a 3/4 teaspoon. So essentially what I'm trying to do is make sure that I feel a very nice, powerful vanilla flavor. One thing to think about as well is if you're using a strong vanilla extract that is a very high alcohol content, like this one is pretty smooth. I actually just worked with a friend of mine to create some ice cream recipes for her ice cream shop that are gonna come out next month. And I took some of my Molina vanilla, and we taste tested side by side her vanilla, which is like a extract that's very alcohol based, and mine is almost like you could almost sip it, like you can't, it still doesn't feel just right. Hers felt very strong. It almost like hurts to drink it. And so with hers, because it's alcohol based, what you find is when you cook it, when you heat it, the alcohol evaporates. So you have the vanilla flavor kind of loses a little bit of its punch. So one thing you can do to avoid that is you can add a little bit more of the extract if you have a really strong alcohol content, or you can wait until you've already kind of cooked down your agar, and you start to see that your liquid starts to become slightly thicker, and then you can add your vanilla towards the end. So just another tip there. So again, I want this layer to get slightly thickened up here and just come to a simmer. I'll continue to whisk and make sure that I'm not sticking anything to the bottom. And the vanilla beans in here would be so nice. Sometimes you see that in ice cream flavors where it says vanilla bean paste, or it'll say real vanilla beans. And when you look at the ice cream and you eat it, you'll see the little brown specks of, you know, vanilla throughout. It's just so much tastier, but it's so much more expensive, which is why a lot of people don't use that. So it's vanilla is kind of a tricky ingredient. And I love using, you know, for these two flavors, especially that we've made so far, I mean, they're very much representative of Mexico. You know, cacao is a native ingredient of Mexico, as is, you know, vanilla. So like imagine the world without cacao, without vanilla. If you added, you know, a little bit of chile to your chocolate round of flavor. I mean, chile is also like inherently a native ingredient to Mexico. So, you know, you can really make this like a very Mexico-centric dish, you know. The strawberries, I don't know too much about the background and history of strawberries. I'm doubtful that the rose water comes from Mexico, so that could be omitted if you wanted to kind of stay true to that. But that could be kind of an interesting culmination of ingredients, just really focusing on native plants, native things from Mexico. So again, I'm starting to see a little bit of this frothiness, mostly because I'm whisking like crazy too. I don't think I'm seeing a simmer just yet. Oh, I see a little bit of a simmer starting here. There we go. So I want to make sure I just keep mixing. And so again, that simmer means to me that my agar is becoming activated. So I'll just give it a couple minutes in that simmer, making sure that I'm not burning anything. And at this point, you can always taste too. You can taste to see if you like the sweetness. So if you started off with less sugar, at this point, your sugar would be melted. So you can taste to see if you need a little bit more. And if you're using, you know, even more like sugar substitutes or things like that that are like a little bit more, you know, less processed or something like that. For example, like a maple syrup could be really good in here. Although I will say that maple syrup definitely has its own flavor profile. So you have to be cautious to not overpower the flavor with maple syrup, just enough to sweeten it, but not enough to make it taste like a maple syrup flavor. Yeah, so I can taste the vanilla really well. I'll give this a couple more minutes. It's nice and sweet. It for me, like the first few times I made this recipe, this one, like I was testing out, I used a little bit too much agar. So I used, instead of a half teaspoon, I'm telling you all the things I did wrong. I used 1 cup of milk versus the 1.5 cups. And then I used 3/4 teaspoons of agar, because I looked at this and I was like, oh, this doesn't feel thick enough for me. So I added another, you know, another little bit of agar. And it was fine eating it, but the texture is like, has a little bit of a bite to it. So it almost feels kind of like, not crunchy, that's not the right word, but it doesn't feel like as smooth as a gelatina should. So I knew I had used too much agar. And the other thing was, I thought that the sweetness level with about 2 teaspoons, that was again using just 1 cup of liquid, for me felt okay. Like I felt like, you know, the sweetness was okay. My partner was like, it's a dessert, it should taste a little bit sweeter. So I don't need a lot of sweetness for it to feel like a dessert. So again, that starts to become your personal preference of like how much sugar you want to add to your particular recipe. So I'm just going to give this another few seconds to work its magic, making sure that my agar is fully incorporated into that liquid, that it's all melted down. And I'll turn off my heat in just a moment and continue to whisk just to help bring the temperature down before I pour this hot liquid over the first layer that we made. Hopefully that first layer has started to kind of solidify a little bit. I don't expect it to be all the way done, but hopefully at least it's sealed. Kind of like a nata, right? Like when you cook milk, it has like a sealed layer at the top. That's kind of what I'm looking for to help create a little bit of that separation. So at this point, I've turned off my heat and I'm just going to keep whisking for a couple minutes. And I'll just help bring that temperature down. One thing I've seen people do at our kitchen, for example, is they might go from this very hot liquid and then they'll have a bowl of ice water and they'll literally put their pot of hot liquid into the bowl of ice water and continue to whisk until it cools down. That could work. I wouldn't do it with my pots here at home necessarily, because when you do that, you can start to warp your pots because you're going from the pot and then you're hitting it with extreme cold. And that could really ruin your pots. You should see the pots and pans at most kitchens. They're pretty ruined. Like they're not flat on the bottom usually. They're kind of warped and things. But it's just, those are kind of the tricks to speed up the process essentially at professional kitchens. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and pull out my cacao layer out of the fridge. I'm crossing my fingers. I don't think that's been a full 15 minutes yet, right? It's probably been like 10. Yeah. Let me check to see how they're looking. Oh, but I'm good. Yeah, this is great. Okay. So I'm gonna leave that hanging out in the stove for just a little bit. While the agar's still hot, it's totally fine. But if I were to let that really cool all the way down, it would start to solidify. And as I'm whisking, I'll start to break it up into like little pieces because it's starting to solidify. So look at this. I can lift this up and show you. Here's my first layer of the cacao. So that is the agar that has been activated. So I can see that it's slightly shifting when I do that, so I don't want to knock it over. And I probably have a little bit in the center that's not all the way solidified just yet, but that was in there for at least 10, 15 minutes. So now I know that I can add the second layer onto here. If yours wasn't that solid, it still had a little bit of kind of jiggliness to it. You can definitely still pour over it as long as you make sure that that top layer of the gelatina is pretty sealed, so that when you pour in, it doesn't just like mix into each other. And again, remember I mentioned earlier that you can just kind of rub off. You can use your nail or rub off this chocolate that kind of smeared the side, or you can grab like a little wet napkin, towel, something like that, to just clean up the edges a little bit and make sure that when you flip it over, it should be like a really nice presentation. But if you have this smeared chocolate on the side, it's going to not look as clean and nice. All right, so as I'm doing this, let me check to see if there's any questions in the chat. Super nice and glossy. Were you talking about this? The gelatina looks super nice and glossy.
Yeah, because it's so shiny, and sometimes you see, like, I remember growing up, we didn't eat it, but we would go to the stores and I would see them, and they would be like full of holes, and sometimes they would look like almost really, really fake, but that's like really glossy, like when you see like what they're called, the mirror cakes.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it might also be, honestly, because I have this ring light right in front of me. So, I mean, this isn't like a true light, a true reflection of light. But yeah, it does look a little glossy, but there's like a big light right in front of my face. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pour in. I'll do it here this time. So I have my 4 pieces. I just got a new laptop, so because my internet wasn't working before, I'll push it back because I think my old laptop gave up because I've poured so much food on it. Okay, so I'm just going to evenly pour in my next layer of vainilla. Being, again, pretty careful not to get it too all over the sides. Just really focusing on trying to pour towards the center of the bowl. All right. And if you wanted these to look very precise, you could also measure out. Oh, and I spilled some on the sides, which is fine. You could also use a measuring cup to measure out exact quantities. So if you were making 3 molds of gelatina, and we used 1.5 cups of liquid, well, then you would measure out about 1/2 cup per per mold. If you were, you know, doing it for 4 like I am, then obviously I think it'll be more like 1/3 of a cup of liquid, but you can do the calculations to figure out how much you would need. So I am going to take these back into the fridge and let that layer solidify. And I'm trying to be extra careful not to tilt my tray. And I think what's helping speed up the process here is that I know that my fridge, the top shelf is extra cold. So I made space on that top shelf exactly where the cold temperature is coming out of. So that kind of helps speed up the process of making them a little bit more solidified. So I'm gonna wash that pot one more time for our 3rd layer. Okay. So I have my pot clean and ready to go for this last layer. The thing I'll do before I pour my milk in there is I have 1/2 cup of strawberries, just fresh strawberries that I just sliced up. They could be frozen, they could be fresh, they could be whatever you have on hand. And I have my last 1.5 cups of the milk. So I'm going to blend these together to make it smooth. And this is what's going to give it this nice sort of rosy color. And it's also going to obviously give that nice strawberry flavor. So I'll grab my blender cup and just really simply put the strawberries in, get all those pieces in there, and then pour your milk in. That's 1.5 cups, the last layer of our milk. And I'm going to just blend this until it's pretty smooth. I don't like to leave too many chunks of strawberry in this because when strawberry cooks, it has like a different consistency to it. So I will blend it until it's pretty smooth and blended into the milk. Other times when I blend strawberries and milk or something like that, I like a little chunkiness if it's a fresh strawberry in there, but it's gonna get a little bit discolored with the heat. So I'm gonna blend it till smooth. So you can see I have this like really nice rose colored pink liquid. So I will pour that liquid into my pot. My pot is turned off. It's still cold. So you can see it's a really nice pink. It's almost like a Nesquik or something like that kind of vibe. And before I turn on my heat, again, I'm gonna add that 1/2 teaspoon of Agar. So I just have a 1/2 teaspoon. I will level out that spoon and go ahead and put that into my mixture. Let me grab my whisk. Oh, my whisk is already in there. Whisk it all until it's incorporated. And then let me go ahead and turn on my heat. And you'll see that this very vibrant pink color is gonna sort of dull out a little bit. So it's not gonna stay as bright as this. Because as strawberries cook, they naturally start to get a little bit darker. So you'll still have a little bit of the pink shade, but it's not going to be a super vibrant pink. Typically what people do when they want to keep that vibrant pink color is they add food coloring. Or alternatively, you could add a touch of beet juice or something like that. You know, I haven't tested the recipe where I blend or I cook the milk with the agar And then once it's hot, I blend it with the strawberries. I don't know how that would activate the agar, but I haven't tested that quite yet, but that might also help with the color if that solution does work. This is like what I'm constantly thinking about, y'all. Like, what if I did it this way instead of that way? Like, I just never thought about that, you know? Like, that's my whole life, trying to figure it out. Okay, before I forget, I want to throw in my other 3 tablespoons of the raw turbinado sugar and my pinch of salt. Obviously, I like to add a pinch of salt to everything that's sweet because it helps to kind of bring out the flavors a little bit more in the dish. So I'll whisk that. And then the other last ingredient that I'll add here is an ingredient that I use a lot. It's rose water. It's a clear liquid. It's very fragrant of rose. You can use this. I've made smoothies with it. You can use it as a toner on your face. You can, you know, add it. I've made strawberry rose tamales. Our amorcito uses, if you haven't had our amorcito, it's a strawberry rose agua fresca that we make that's really popular. We use rose water quite a bit. So it's a really, really flavorful ingredient. And in fact, a very little of it goes a long way. Like as soon as I open it, it's very fragrant of rose. So you don't want to use too much of it. I'm only going to use ½ teaspoon of rose. And now that I've finished up with these measuring spoons, I'm going to use the same ½ teaspoon that I was using for the agar. So a ½ teaspoon. I want to be really careful to not over pour of the rose water. So that's not a lot. It's going to be all I need for this recipe. Seriously, make yourself a smoothie like midday, strawberries, nut-based milk, a little bit of maple syrup, and some rose water with ice. It's nice. It's like very soothing and relaxing. I've also made lattes where I'll heat up some oat milk. I'll pour a little bit of rose water. I have rose hip tea bags. I'll put that in there and a few rose petals, dried rose petals. And that's also like a very nice, relaxing tea that you can have as well too. It helps with digestion and also helps to just kind of mellow out. You know, think of like that smell of rose is like very soothing, like a lavender would be. Okay, so again, I have this frothiness here. I can still see my pink color here in the center. I think I've gotten to a little bit of a simmer. Maybe not quite, almost there. I don't know if that's bubbles or simmer. Yeah, it's starting to get to a little bit of a simmer. And I want to cook this to the point where I see that simmering happening. I know my agar has dissolved, but I don't want to overcook this because the more I cook it, the more sort of like of the dark red, or I guess like the brownish red will become too prominent, you know? So I want to keep a little bit of this like pink color to it. And again, that was ½ cup of strawberries. I think I mentioned that, but I just wanted to reiterate. That was ½ cup of strawberries. I sliced them up so that I can measure them a little bit more easily in the cup. Because if you put whole strawberries in there, you're going to have gaps, you know, in between. So I just slice them, or you can quickly chop them up and just kind of get more close to your ½ cup measurement. Okay. So I was pretty sure, yeah, I'm seeing a simmer bubbling up here. So I just want to keep this going for just a couple more minutes. I'm actually getting a little out of control now, so I'm going to lower my temperature a little bit because I don't want this to bubble over and get too hot. And I'll just give this another minute or so before I turn off the heat. You can see it doesn't take too long. It's mostly because we don't have a lot of mixture in here, 1.5 cups plus the strawberries. You know, we've been doing a cup and a half of liquid. So it doesn't take too long for it to come to temperature. And then the other thing is because this liquid is like so, you know, runny, it also is easy to heat up versus something that's a little bit thicker. All right, just another 30 seconds or so. I lowered my heat a little bit because it was getting too bubbly for me. And I actually made a round of this gelatina before our class today, so I can show you what it looks like when it's complete. And I walked away to try to, because I got this new laptop and I was trying to set up the Wi-Fi. And then I wasn't whisking the whole time with the strawberry layer. So I think it looks a little bit separated to me, and a little more dark than I would like it. But I was trying to multitask and it didn't work out. But this one's a really nice pink hue. I'll go ahead and turn that off and I'll just keep whisking just another minute or so to try to lower that heat. You can also move it to a part of your stove that isn't as hot, you know, to try to lower that temperature a little bit. All right, and while that continues to cool down, I'm going to pull that second layer out and let's see, hopefully it helps solidify a little bit. Ooh, it's still a little jiggly, but I think it's going to work okay. So let me bring these over so you can see along with me. So you can see here, like this one, it actually is less liquid, so it's a little bit more firm. I can tilt it without it, you know, spilling over. Whereas this one that had more liquid, you can see how jiggly it is. If I move this like this, it would run, it would move too much. So, and then this that's here, just so you can see, you know, the little bit of that spilled onto the tray. Check this out. It's like a gelatina now. So it like moves around like a gelatina, which is pretty crazy. So that's just from being in there for a few minutes. So at least this one has that little bit of, like I said, the nata, or the top layer has solidified, but the center is definitely jiggly and needs more time. So I'm still going to pour that last layer on here, and I want to give it a good amount of time in the fridge before I flip these over, so that I make sure that I'm not flipping over something that's still pretty liquidy. And these are metal, they're enamel, essentially, they're peltre, so I can feel the temperature with my hands. This feels a little bit more chilled. This one was actually closer to the back of the fridge, which is where the coolness is coming from, whereas these still feel pretty room temp, which is probably why they're not as solidified just yet. So I'm gonna add my last layer here of my lovely pink strawberry rose flavored gelatina. Ooh, look. So that one was not ready. I had a little bit of breaking that happened there. So I probably shouldn't have poured into that one. Let me pour into these back two and then leave the other one alone. Or actually, I'll just do it because I'm kind of curious to see how it turns out. This is always a test for me to see how things turn out. But these two are totally fine. Let me pour a little bit into this one. I think the other thing that caused that to rupture was probably because I poured a little too heavy-handed. So when the pouring, if I would have poured a little bit more gently, maybe I could have got away without piercing the that layer. Okay, so I'll go ahead and put the last rounds into the fridge very carefully. I'll put the side back first. I'm curious to see how that one's gonna look. Ooh. Okay. And as I mentioned, I have one that I made before. Hopefully it came out okay because I, essentially what I did is I reduced the recipe. So instead of using a half teaspoon of agar, I calculated what a third of that would be because I was gonna do like 3 of these molds. And I didn't have that measuring spoon, so I just eyeballed it a little bit. So my firmness might be a little bit off, but I can see here that, you know, it is a firm to the touch, but it also has a little bit of jiggle to it, which is what a gelatina has, right? So hopefully, I'm gonna keep my fingers crossed that this works out okay. I'm gonna grab my little plate here to flip it over. So the first round that I made this, it was sticking really a lot to the, it wasn't sticking to the side of the bowl, but it was almost like suctioned to the bowl. So like as I try to flip it over, it wouldn't flip. Let's see if I'm able to do this without digging my hands into it. There we go. There it is. I have a super thin layer of the vanilla, but it's there, as you can see. So I am going to just show you how I garnish this, and then I'll take a bite into it. So I have here, you can put whole strawberries, or it really looks nice if you, let me grab a little knife here. If you just slice the strawberries in half, let me do it here. So if you slice the strawberries in half and you do like cut side up, that always looks really pretty. Ooh, and you can see that I have a little bit of like, if I move this around too much, the layers are like on top of each other, but they're not like glued together essentially. So I have to be very careful there. I have a little bit of rose petals. This is optional. If you added the rose to it, this is a nice indicator to people that there's rose somewhere in this dish. And it just looks really pretty as well too. And then I also have a little bit of cacao nibs, which I really like because the gelatina is soft. So these cacao nibs are gonna be a little bit of a crunch. And it just kind of gives a nice textural play on this dish. You can add as many of those as you'd like. And then I'm gonna grab my spoon, grab a clean spoon. And I can give this a little taste. So I will, you can see it has a little jiggle to it, right? Hopefully it's all solidified. I made this right before class. It has, okay. Let me grab a bigger piece of it. All right, so my layers are coming away from each other, but you can see here that I have my 3 layers, my cacao, my vanilla, and my strawberry rose. It's so good. The crunch of the cacao is really nice. And the other reason I love cacao nibs and things is because they're nice and bitter and they're not sweet. Obviously, it's literally just cacao pieces. And so it's just like really nice with the sweetness of the gelatina. In addition to the cacao nibs, it just creates a nice balance. So this is our final dish here. For folks who have not made gelatina, which was a couple folks in the chat, what do you all think? Is this something that you think is pretty It's not too difficult to make. It's just a few steps, right?
I
You
think I'm ready
made
to
it look
try it.
easy. Yeah,
Hmm?
you made it look easy.
Yeah,
I think
it's not.
I'm ready to try this for Thanksgiving.
Yes, that would be great. And you can definitely, I would suggest to, I'm like trying to stuff my face right now. Because I know gelatinas, usually we see them like in a bigger mold and people will bring them. I think if you're going to do this, it might be good to not flip it over into another mold, but like have it, like take it in the dish that you set it in, if that makes sense. So like you would take it in like the bowl that we made it in, right? Versus like flipping it over and taking that. Because I saw the first couple times that I made it, I didn't have this sliding situation, but you know, in transit, you could have some sliding that happens. So, so yeah, I would suggest taking it in the bowl that you're making it in.
So how long can it stay in the refrigerator before you serve it? Like how long in advance can you make it?
I would make it, I mean, I think you can make it the day before and be totally fine. I would just cover it with plastic wrap or, you know, something like that to make sure that you don't get it, that it doesn't dry out. But I would wait to add the plastic wrap until after, especially if you're gonna, if you were gonna go visit family and take it in the bowl that you, like you put it in the fridge in, wait until it cools down in the fridge. And then once it's cool, take it out and cover it in plastic wrap. Because if you put the plastic wrap on while it's hot, you're gonna have condensation. The steam is gonna rise to the plastic and then you're gonna have all this water and it's gonna drip onto the gelatina. It's gonna stain it essentially. It's gonna make it look a little funky. So let it cool and then cover it.
So about how big are your little containers? Are they like a cup or 2 cups, do you think? Or
These are about, I think like a cup and a, here, let me just measure right now so I can just know, because I think I always estimate what it is. I'll just do it with water.
I know, because in it's nice that you make them like individual like that. I'm trying to think, what do I have that would, you know, be similar to that?
Yeah, so this is one. It's about a cup and a third. So it's 1 full cup and another third of a cup. And I was able to make 4 molds and they weren't filled all the way up to the top. So, you know, so you could also use like a bigger one if you wanted to and just make it all one versus like several little ones. But if you did that, I would definitely suggest to just keep it in the original tray that you make it cold in. And I almost wonder because this has only been in the fridge during our class right now, this one that I'm tasting. So I wonder if, you know, over a little bit more time in the fridge, if it'll set a little bit better without sliding away so much. But it's good.